Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue today on the 9th installment of the special theme, how we can carry our growth of consciousness into our next life deliberately. And we invite you all to address more questions on this subject during our conversation in the chat box, or you may send beforehand your questions at our email integralstudies.in@gmail.com. I will start with one nice question we received from Luke, which derived from our previous session. Thank you very much for having truly addressed my question in evenings 240. These issues are highly precious to me, and your structured description regarding individualization, organization, richness, expression, true individual integration is a key guideline for my sadhana. Thank you also for your explanation of an easy entryway to the precise perception of the invisible stratas by focusing on an intuitive component of the principle of different environments or inner movements, and alternating between one and another to build a continuity of consciousness and substance. The process is very clear and handy, and I understand that developing this practice should build my capacity to really see and touch the detailed content of the subtle worlds, such as beings and landscapes that Sri Aurobindo and Imada describe, and to let them appear to me as concrete as I mentally understand they are. At different occasions, you advise not to focus on the form of what emerges during experiences, while meditating, for instance, since it can be distorted or deliberately deceptive. Could you please explain how doing so is compatible with the detailed perception of the subtle worlds?
It's an important question, and in continuation to the discussion last time and Luke's questions of last time. So, I would like to take several parts of the questions themselves in sequence. First, this observation of being able to sense different qualities, grades of consciousness, qualities of influences, being able to shift between, discriminate between, etc. This process actually can be a continuing, lifelong awareness, skill, effort that one does at all times in the midst of all activities. All this, remember, where you place your attention, where you direct your interest, is where things begin to grow and open and deepen. So the fact that you observe these things, pay attention, already the process starts of discriminating because of the intent behind, and the familiarity begins to happen. If further you've been exposed to a wide variety of rich experiences, then you have also references, oh, this feels like that feels like that. And when you recognize a particular new experiential quality, you say, it corresponds to that vibration which I had experienced there or in that situation. Otherwise, when it comes the first time, you don't know what it is, and you have no names for these things. Finally, these are states or qualities of consciousness. So just this will automatically start a process of organizing awareness of inner and higher realms or gradations of consciousness. The subsequent part of the question is about seeing actually beings and landscapes. So there are two forms that can take place. One is when you go out of the body, and there, of course, there is the objectivized experience of those worlds. The other is while you're still in the body, and either of two states happens. You go deep within, and in an inner realm, your consciousness opens out to those worlds. Without needing to actively separate from the physical body, your perception there could open of those worlds. And full flow of images and landscapes, beings, etc. can be felt, seen, experienced, while still being embodied, but in an inner state. The second variation to this would be a seeing by an opening of subtle sight. And that can happen with eyes open while being on the surface state, etc. Now, there's a difference between the two. Whenever we speak of subtle sight having opened, one may see things, but the consciousness which is seeing is the surface consciousness, and itself is not of the grade of the thing that it sees. And so there is always a diminution, there's always a reduction, there is always a representation in which something is lost or something is misunderstood, or as Luke has mentioned, that sometimes the images can be deliberately deceptive, also projected by something else, someone else, to deceive you, or they could be distorted, reflected, or symbolic. So there are many variations possible, but the opening of subtle sight in itself is not of much great use if the deeper familiarity of those states has not been developed, or if the intuitive and the psychic discrimination have not been developed. Intuitive consciousness and psychic discrimination. If those are developed, they can as if cut through the appearance in the subtle sight and go to something deeper. But generally now I will focus on the more useful thing, which is while in the inner states, the opening to those domains. And there I have generally advised not to focus too much on forms for two reasons. First has to do with your priority. What is it that you're seeking when you go into the inner ranges? For many people, the going into the inner range is an end in itself. I go within, I feel good, I stop there, maybe from there there's a devotion or love or an aspiration, or just a calm and quiet, or a daydream sometimes. Quite a large number of people, when you go to collective meditation, slip into a kind of a daydream in a feel-good state, which is fine. But then it stops, you're not even trying to do anything more. But there would be others who would actively try to go deeper. And there the question would be asked, for what, where, what is your focus, what is your ultimate goal? And if, as should be our priority, the focus is on the psychic presence deep within, the true soul within, the immortal person that is at the center of our existence, then the focus on any images and forms in between as an intermediate experience would be a distraction. And as a distraction would shake your focus from that one-pointedness required to get all the way to the psychic presence. Even the slightest turn, oh, that's interesting, is enough to take you off track from that purpose. If that pops up, you say, it's there, but no, I don't distract myself. I'm aware of the thing, but I don't pay much attention to its importance. Keep this as the most important. Then you can go deeper and deeper until you really get to the thing in itself. So that is the first reason why I would generally discourage from focusing too much on the forms and of images which come as in the intermediate passages. The second reason has to do with the nature of the passage itself. In the intermediate passages, there are many layers and zones. There is the inner vital, inner mental, and within that there are lower and higher ranges and so on. Exactly as you have in the objectivized experience of the subtle worlds when out of the body. You're experiencing all those things, and depending on where you enter from, where you are in the inner state, you can tap into any of these, or any of these might pop up from somewhere and push forward. And I had a case where during one of the meditation exercises that we were going through, this lady was in her own thing and when I asked afterwards what happened, and she said, I was seeing landscapes and scenes flowing, etc. And I said, what happened to what we were doing, which is to get to that thing deeper? I was so fascinated by this. So it can be entertaining, but I would still ask, after you've seen all that, what then? It would still be pointless. So if your goal is towards that, inmost, then there is a purpose to ignoring. But even then, if your goal is to actually explore these scenes, etc., you do that. You ignore then the other priority of the inmost concentration. You want to explore whatever comes. What do you do with it? What is the value of all the scenes you see? It's as if you can have endless shows of all kinds of cinemas and sceneries and beings and people. Sometimes some of them may want to communicate with you, but what is the validity? What is the reliability? What is the utility? What grade is it? How is it helping you in your spiritual growth? There's a whole range that you really need to question on why you're doing this. So Generally, my advice has been that's not important. But if you still want to explore that, then you should have developed a little bit at least of the psychic discrimination and the intuition. Then you will see through, let's say, a form, a being, a domain appears and communicates a certain quality or appearance, or sometimes they can be extremely deceptive because they can pick from you your expectation of what would convince you and project exactly that back to you. And so you get exactly what you're expecting and hoping for in your fantasy, and you say, wow, this is it. Except if you have the psychic discrimination, something will say, something is not okay. This is simulation, this is a pretense, this is an appearance, and you'll feel it, you will know it. So the form is not reliable in itself because we are entering domains where form is not the priority. Quality of consciousness, power of consciousness, state of consciousness, substance of consciousness, those are more important. Form is malleable. The same grade, quality, substance of consciousness could be represented in a whole variety of forms. Even when we go into the pure psychic domain or even in a real spiritual experience, when those experiences or states represent themselves in form, instead of catching the form, if you stay with the quality, then you're more likely to hold something of value because next time it will come with the same quality but not necessarily with the same form. But when you're in an intermediate domain, again, if your focus is on the form, then you can be easily deceived. If your focus is on the quality, then you catch the thing which is behind the form and you recognize. So you mentioned form can be distorted, yes. You say deliberately deceptive, yes. But it can also be reflected and therefore representative of something but not quite it, or it could be symbolic and actually substance of that consciousness but now symbolically represented. The point is when you come back to that state again, the symbolism could be different, could be entirely different. And so you will say, hey, this is a different experience. No, it's actually the same experience symbolized, represented differently. So if from the beginning you're entering a domain where form is not the priority, but you're a denizen, a citizen of a world of form which is physical, where form is fixed, you enter a domain where form is not fixed and you still use or you still assess things based on your values of the physical world, you are going to be deceived, even if it's not intended to deceive you. So always the focus should be on quality, consciousness, what's behind form, and using form at best as an entry point. The same would apply when you're out of body, you meet scenes, landscapes, people. How do you know it's not a projected world that someone has created which is projected onto you? And you're actually lost in a bubble of somebody else's creation. We spoke last time, the terms Sri Aurobindo used were the two worlds, constructed worlds versus original worlds. And the constructed worlds could be constructed by an entity that throws it to you and kind of surrounds you with that, and you say, oh, this is beautiful heaven, except it's totally a creation of somebody else, isn't it? So it's not a world in itself. But if you're familiar with the sense of vibe behind the form, you'll feel, but this is not quite it. The form image does not correspond to the vibe of the substance which is from which it's made. Something is not okay. And then you stare intently to cut through as if see behind by an intuitive or a psychic discrimination, and you see, it's coming from this. So this habit of not stopping with form, because we are programmed in the physical world to stop with form, the habit to go behind is going to be useful in all these circumstances. And when you're out of the body and a being comes, and a very beautiful being says, I am the most wonderful god of this or that, or the most seductive and charming form says, here I am for whatever. If you sense that, there's something not okay here, and you continue to pierce through the appearance, it cuts through, and then you see the thing itself behind, and it can be very, very different from what the charming image might be. So always the habit of going behind form would be useful. Nevertheless, it's not contradictory or incompatible with the perception of these worlds. You would enjoy the forms themselves, but if you have the habit of seeing behind, you will catch the substance and quality and essentiality of it. And then you can even reshape the forms if you so choose to, without losing that. So I generally advise this overall as a good practice when you enter the inner domains, or for any psychic or spiritual development also. I think that part is reasonably handled. I come back to the first portion of the question, which is more a summary of what we discussed last time, um, where he summarized the description regarding individualization, organization, richness, expression through individual integration, etc., as guidelines in the sadhana. Upon this, I want to add something more. Um, so, I spoke of individualization of the vital and the mental being, which are already separate things. Then the organization around that individuality, which is developed on each of these levels. Then the richness of the experiences and the flowering on each of these levels. Then the ability to express in words, in form, in action, in thought, etc. All for both of these. And then the integration of everything around the true person, which is the psychic being, now taking place rather than some individualization of a superficial center. And the mind itself, I highlighted the ability for the mind to stand back and guide this integration process to ensure that a lower or inferior thing does not hijack the higher or the inner, which is so common, so frequent. And something within you says, I think there's been a hijack, let me correct the balance. This has to preside over that and not the other way. So there has to be a part of your mind which has to be able to stand back and hold that overall guiding position and warning position. And if you have a background that comes from this reading of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, or generally of an understanding of this kind, that part of the mind will say, yes, I've been warned about this is what I observe, let me correct for it. So all this I had discussed last time, but there were two more steps which I ignored. Because sometimes there is a sense of time, or we've spent already too much time, but also these two steps are normally for most people not even within their priority of interest. And so for most people working on a preliminary effort of organization and integration of the mind or enriching it, that's too far away. But I want to highlight these two because otherwise that theme of discussion would not be complete. So two more steps are to be added to what we discussed last time. One is the intuitivization. Once you've built this very rich, organized, integrated, let's say mind or vital or both even, each of these in its own domain now, let's say centered around, organized around at least the psychic influence, each of these parts of our being, and eventually all parts and all functions, needs to be turned to the higher influence of the intuition above. Now, the beauty of this process is the intuition being of a domain already fundamentally above mind, its influence can easily flow down to fill the mind, and then through the mind flow into the vital. So normally intuitivization will begin in your highest, subtlest grade of the mind's development. There you will feel this, and it's plastic, it's bright. You'll feel the descent of the intuitive influence first, and then as a light, and then as a substance, and then the infusion of that substance which lifts and purifies and changes the mental working and so on. And then from there it'll seep into the mental part of the vital first, and then through that into the rest of the vital to further intuitivize that. So there are many people, and especially this is commonly seen in women, that the intuitivization of the vital by a reflected process has already begun before the intuition of the mind. And there is a danger with that, because there is obviously something which comes, yes, I feel this, I know this, but because it is coming without the freedom that comes with the mind and the mind's ability to correct itself, the vital can seize upon the intuition and warp, distort, or even cover it, misread it, or many other variations are possible. So if despite that opening, you may still start with that, but then focus on the part of the vital that turns to mind and which can bring a greater clarity using this process already begun, and then eventually let it grow into the fullness of the mind itself and the vital. So this intuitivization process is going to happen more and more by a direct opening of these now developed parts to this higher influence that flows down. It's still not over. Beyond this comes a stage which, a word which I rarely use because it is something so misunderstood for most people, and the word would be supramentalization. So there are unfortunately people who catch that word. It's like a catch-all word for anything which is higher, above, or fitting any fancy, and they want to say, oh, this is now supramental, or I'm aiming for supramental, etc. No, it doesn't work like that. There is even, I recently came across somebody who actually claimed that she's living in supramental consciousness or having supramental experiences. Yes, she would surely have some experience, but they're not supramental. For the supramental consciousness to be directly experienced, Sri Aurobindo explains the requirements. First, the entire inner domain, inner mind, inner vital, inner physical, has to be fully opened out and universalized. Second, the psychic center has to be fully brought forward and taken charge of all these layers. Third, each of these layers has to be able to open out to its own sense of infinity on all these layers. And at that point, you have a vehicle upon which the supramental consciousness can even put a direct drop. And a drop only we're speaking of in the beginning. That's already quite a way out. And somebody who has reached that is already, you see it very differently. So very few people could say of even having reached to this point. So this word supramental is thrown about loosely. I even had somebody, because he was working in a certain medical field with plants, he said, I'm trying to find out which plants would be effective to open somebody to supramental consciousness. And it just shows you the utter ignorance in first what the supramental means, the word itself, and what it represents, and its relationship to plants which are used for therapeutic purposes. So this word one has to be very careful, and better not to throw it around unless you really appreciate what it means. But without the intuitivization, the supramental experience or the supramental infusion would not happen, and equally without the supramentalization, like the intuitivization, the fullness of that growth and fulfillment and transformation would not be. So these two steps are essential to follow eventually, and it's important to recognize them, and it's important to know them and even to aspire for them. And of that, treat both steps as integrated in the intuitivization process, because the supramental, when it projects a ray, a finite ray and a limited touch of a point of touch, that's your intuitivization, that's your intuition. So treat this as a continuum across two very different stages of the perfection. But with the supramental comes the perfection. Until then you do not have perfection, or you have partial perfections, and all of those are good. But the divinization and the divine perfection would happen only with that. But this should be, in fact, our stated intention, at least, even if at this point it seems far. But if you have any touch of the intuitive, then it's not far. Its eventual inevitability is felt already. So I think this would cover everything. We go to the next question.
Nikhil, am I right to think that individualization is the state of freedom of mind from the gravitational pull of the matter, body consciousness, and life consciousness? Is individualization the emergence of psychic being, the Chaitanya Purusha, a term given by Sri Aurobindo?
So to the first part of the question, I will say no, not quite. To the second part, I could say yes, but not quite. So let me elaborate. The freedom of mind from the influence of matter, inertia of matter, let's say, body and life consciousness, etc., is not in itself individualization. It's just freedom. So there are two things to be done. You need to separate out a grade from influence of a lesser grade. So mind has to be freed from the emotional confusion or the physical inertia. But that alone is not individualization. Individualization would require a focal point around which all the operations of mind are organized. So go back to the discussion last time where this has been fully elaborated. So I won't repeat that. But make the distinction here. Separation to free from a lower influence is not in itself individualization. Individualization would imply a degree of separation from those influences, but again that separation may not be complete. And to that extent, the individualization, even in mind's thought, would be compromised by its dependence or the influence from below being able to confuse or cloud or even limit the degree of freedom that the individualization would have brought in the mind. So they're quite two very different things, and even orthogonal in some way. The second part of the question, where you say the individualization is emergence of the psychic being Chaitya Purusha, not necessarily. You can have an individualization around any point. You can have an individualization around the external mind ego focus, and that's also an individualization. But eventually that organized individuality should fill with the true psychic being from within, and it should become the focal point. Or that focal point outside, formed as an individual intellectual focus, let's say, around an intellectual focus, should now turn inward and submit itself to the psychic being. Why? Why not just cling to an individuality of some kind? Because that external individuality is not real, is not lasting, is not good enough. It does not have the permanence, does not have the true discrimination, does not have the truth or the touch of truth, which are properly found only in the psychic being. So necessarily the two have to join, or the psychic has to replace the temporary individuality. It can happen by the inner pushing outward, or the outer turning inward and submitting itself to the influence of the psychic, and progressively allowing that influence to replace its own separate drives. So yes, this is what I had also mentioned last time about the integration around the psychic. But there are again two different things. So emergence of the psychic, yes, would represent an aspect of the individuality, but not wholly it, and sufficient, not necessarily even for it to emerge, for individuality to form. Okay, so we go to the next question.
From Maurice, you said that in a number of cases, the soul chooses in which family it will reincarnate. On the other hand, I had read somewhere that souls often incarnate in groups. And what about family ties? If family relations are good in present life, we love to meet again in another life. I suppose it is a matter of free choice, but it is also a matter of karma. 2 years ago, one of my brothers left his body. In my meditation, it felt as if somebody took care of him as a mother does, taking her child by the hand. It is said that often the deceased is waited for by a relative. Is this possible?
Yes, so I'll take the last part of the question first. When a person leaves the body, there is a transitional passage which can be difficult for many. And what you felt in your meditation, that somebody took care of him as a mother does, taking her child by the hand, yes, it's absolutely true. Especially if your brother had already a spiritual opening and an opening to the Divine Mother in whatever form, aspect, etc. Then there is obviously, at the moment of departure, if the consciousness turns towards that in aspiration, seeking that help and support, there is always the response. We also spoke earlier about the special being Mother created to help the transition and the tunnel. So that also would be felt, experienced in this way, in a very deep motherly affection and love that it takes the person and helps to make the transition. That's the nature of that being. It is a being of love. But about relatives waiting on the other side, yes, but that's more complex. Sometimes there are the beings who come to help. They see inside you that, because your consciousness is transparent to them, they see that if they were to appear as they are, you would either get confused or even afraid. So they see inside you the form that you are expecting or which you would feel comfortable with, and they take on that form and come to you with that form, and you say, it is my grandmother who I love so much. The real one might have already reincarnated, but she has come to take me. I feel so good because the love I feel from her is so strong. But it is the same love of the being which you described earlier, but it would be in that form. It can also occasionally happen if that relative is still in the intermediate passages and not gone into the psychic sleep already, then that person might be around and might say, hey, I'm also drawn to help in the transition. That can happen. But as such, that part is rare. It is mostly the beings who try to help you who take on the form that would be most suitable for you to not feel distressed. Yes, so this is possible, but not the way you might have thought that it happened. But coming to your first part of the questions, when you say souls often incarnate in groups, it doesn't mean they incarnate as a group in the same place. It could be that a group of souls comes with a sense of purpose to align for a special work. And for that purpose, they have come, and so there is a commonality of purpose across them. If they meet in the physical, and they could be across the world, if they meet in the physical domain, then if they are aware of this deeper alignment of their sense of purpose, that means already the psychic influence is reasonably strong on the surface, and the mind is reasonably organized to be able to articulate or feel that sense of purpose, then you would recognize, yes, that person has exactly the same affinity and alignment to that value. I'll give an example here. So this was a lady who had come to Pondicherry, and now nearly 20 years ago. And for some reason she had come, somebody sent her to me, and we had some discussion about things. She was really just looking for something deeper, and we spoke, and I showed her helped her to get to a certain experience of the inner consciousness, and it was nice. So she asked me at some point, what is your year of, I saw in some booklet your year of birth is 1967, and she said, it's interesting, I have the same year of birth, and I'm interested in this because somebody channeling or somebody told her that year many people came for a specific thing. So she came from that background. But what I looked at, which was interesting, was that the mother had made an observation, I think it was in this same period, 1966, 67, where she said that a group of souls had come for her work. Now, what I found common with her was that there was this particular vibe. And I said, yes. She was looking for it based on something she had heard. I recognized it in terms of the vibrational quality of her, let's say, seeking. Subsequently, maybe we exchanged one email first, or a couple of emails. That's it. I had no further contact with her at all. But the vibe which was there in that touch, that stayed somewhere. So it does not mean as a group that you will come and physically meet as a group and do things. It just means there's a commonality of purpose for a larger work and spiritual purpose. Sometimes you meet, sometimes you don't. Sometimes even in that, what you speak of group, there are ties which are not at all to do with family ties. They are ties of the soul relation, and there will be specific objectives for which they might align or not, or briefly align and then separate, and many variations are possible. So we'll touch upon this a little more when we read today's text, and I will elaborate with those examples. Family ties, in most cases from the soul's point of view, have little or no value at all. Even if you have good relations, you love to meet people, you say, I would like, maybe next life we'll meet again. It's all superficial, emotional. The soul's relation is fundamentally different. And you experience this only when you have the experience of what it's like to separate from the physical world entirely and prepare to break away. And at that point, you look back, and among all the dozens, or for some people, hundreds of friends or acquaintances you might have had, or a few dozen that might be very close to you, out of all those, perhaps one or two might stand out, and they would be purely because of this very deep spiritual affinity or the shared spiritual aspiration. And that's about it. Even one or two would be normally a surprise. But in most cases, there's very little that's there in terms of the surface affections and loves and closenesses. They have practically no value from the soul's point of view. But when you choose to reincarnate, there are many cases we find where the reincarnation is happening in the same family or somebody nearby. That has to do not because of the family relation, not because, I like this person. That's to do with a certain affinity of the spiritual track, the spiritual line of the work taken up. I had somebody in my class, my age group in the school, that the mother had particularly recognized that he was the reincarnation of his grandfather, who had come to Sri Aurobindo and the mother earlier. And so he took birth within the same family, not because of the family attachment, but because of the spiritual affinity to the place that the family offered. The culture of values and of the devotion and opening to the mother's consciousness, which was held in the family, it is that which drew him. And it was convenient because there was already a certain affinity, and the rebirth itself took place reasonably close. So the elements of your vital mental substance of the prior personality, some of them may be retained, which would help for having those family bonds. But as such, that's rare and it's not the rule. And so your last part of the question, is it a matter of free choice or also a matter of karma? Sometimes there might be karmic complexities, but that is rare for such things. The karmic complexities would center around things which are of very deep either suffering, consequence, or with spiritual import. In such cases, you might have affinities forming, but they need not happen immediately after. They can be set aside for a series of lives and then activated at a different life. Because the soul can choose which aspect or part of the karmic compulsions it wishes to bring forward for the line of experience it wants to develop. So I'll give here an extraordinary example. There was in the Indian history Aurangzeb and his brother Dara. Dara was killed by Aurangzeb. Dara was highly spiritual, highly open to he was studying the Upanishads, the Gitas and so on, with a deep spiritual content in his own life, and which was naturally reflected in his position as king to the way he organized the, let's say, administrative priorities. Aurangzeb was a crude, brute butcher in history, and he overthrew his brother, kills him, takes over, and brings his butchery and barbarism into the administrative framework. So this is a part of known history. Now it happens so that in the ashram, Sri Aurobindo being what he was, some of the greatest leaders, individuals, players in history, of human history, were called around him. All those who had worked or had been in some way influential, responsible at various evolutionary transitions, all these were called. And so among them were these two, interestingly. And in this life, the person Sri Aurobindo named Dara, and the person who was Aurangzeb was specifically instructed by Sri Aurobindo to serve Dara. They were living in the ashram main building, if I remember right, and that man was made to serve him. What Sri Aurobindo was doing was correcting for the harm done in that incarnation, in their interrelation, but also in the huge burden that had been built up by the mass massacre that Aurangzeb was responsible for. And so a huge work was happening there. It may be something so trivial from a human perspective, because we see only two people and we don't know what's happening inside them. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes at the deeper soul level and the journey and its import in larger history. So it's one interesting example of a karmic bind, a karmic knot, but the way Sri Aurobindo dealt with it, even to dissolve and to help them break through and grow forward, is fascinating. So yes, there is free choice, but even the matter of karma is part of the free choice. It's as if you can choose what aspect or part of karma, when, to what degree you are able to bring out. Of course, a lot of this, remember, is subject to the soul's maturity. The more mature, the greater the freedom exercised. The less mature, the less evolved, the more automatic and impulsive these trends would be. But let's always look from the higher point of view. The principle is that the freedom always overrides. The freedom includes freedom to choose when and how and what form in the karmic compulsions also would be activated. But they're generally tied around really serious things. They're not tied around, hey, you slapped me in this life, so next life I have to slap you back. That's kind of trivial nonsense. It does not work like that. These are really deep compulsions which connect and compel. So we can go to the next question.
From Shrivali, from the book Introducing the Life Divine by Pandiji, in the chapter Triple Transformation, page 123, the last question was about euthanasia, to which Pandiji has cited Sri Aurobindo and answered the question. It is a lengthy answer, of which I have a question from the last line, the lines being: the soul may have chosen that suffering. It may be a karmic legacy which the soul wants to work out in this life. Otherwise, it has to face the same situation in its next birth. So, unless you can enter into that depth and understand, you have no right to interfere with another's life, whether it is a human life or an animal life. Please explain, what does karmic legacy mean? Especially, what does the word legacy mean in this context? And secondly, I would also like to know what could be happening with the brain dead people. Could it be a soul's choice?
So the idea is relating around the question of euthanasia. Somebody is in a severe pain because of some illness or some injury, and would you accept to kill the person out of mercy to put him out of the pain and misery? And more this is now being encouraged around the world, and we are even they want to formalize this. Even I saw some pretty shocking reports that in Canada, in some cases, they advised a person who was in severe debt and had no money to be able to pay back, that they should accept euthanasia. So it's being brought up by some of the what we have discussed earlier as a satanic cabal interests, which want to really harm spiritually the evolving higher part of humanity. But the question itself is a difficult question, because when you see extreme suffering, and the second part of the question, somebody who's brain dead, that you see the person being able to not function at all, and it looks as if brain functions have stopped. What does it mean? So first part is in suffering. The comment which Panditji had made in elaborating Sri Aurobindo's answer, that there could be complexities behind for that pain, for that suffering. And if you cannot see what that is, it's better not to interfere. I gave the example of a couple of sessions ago when I spoke of how my teacher, when he left his body, in the last 1 month, he literally took upon himself the burden of so many people and their karmas, as if consuming, burning them up, because his own body was about to go through a passage which was of great pain and suffering, because he was choosing to quit in the middle when his biology was extremely strong. So the process of disintegration and breaking and tearing apart is extremely painful, because everything in your life forces instinctively in the biology will resist. So it's a painful passage to withdraw in this way when your biology is not yet reached its ripe stage, ready for withdrawal. So he chose at that point to take upon himself this. Now, if we know this and can see this, then although we see the body going through intense suffering, we don't necessarily say, hey, let's take to euthanasia. Because there's something being done, there's a choice made. In his case, it's a spiritual person, so it's a different story. But the same principle would apply in a different context, where it's not obviously a spiritual person. But still, well, we are all spiritual beings because we are souls to begin with. So in that sense, the soul might have made a choice of a certain kind. It might be using that passage of intense pain or suffering for specific purposes. Some of them may have to do with karmic things which it wants to deal with, or it may be using that as a way of going through a certain kind of experience for purpose of its growth and learning to manage that. So there could be many reasons around this, and it is better not to interfere just because the surface personality is struggling and suffering. What is the soul's choice? If you can see there, then you can make a reasonable decision. Otherwise, general principle should be what medicine would do: palliative, minimize the pain, minimize the suffering, etc. Those should be done. But euthanasia, where you put an end to life, that should not be done in any of these cases, well, to the extent possible, because we do not understand always the full scope of what the being wants. Coming to the part of the question where he says brain dead, where she says brain dead people, there it's again complex because our current biology is still insufficient. We have had cases where people declared brain dead, have been brain dead now 10, 20, 30 years, and at the end of 30 years, the person suddenly wakes up one day with full functioning consciousness and with full memory of everything that happened during those 20, 30 years. What does it mean? That means what you called brain dead was not actually brain dead. It might have been brain low function, but it has nothing to do with brain. It has to do with the person and the consciousness behind. And so can you measure that? Can you recognize that just through brain measurements? No, not necessarily, obviously, because in these cases it was wrong diagnosis. There is in fact now a much more complex way of assessing, where what they do is they put the person into a scanner, fMRI, where you're watching the actual parts of the brain lighting up as there is thought or response within. And a person is asked certain questions. At the moment that they are asked questions, if there is activity as if in response to the question, then you see that, oh, the person is not brain dead, there's something happening. Even though the normal activity which would be slated as brain dead is marked as brain dead, but there's something behind at a deeper level which is coming out in response to those questions only. So then you say, well, it's not really brain dead, or there's a possibility to bring that person back in consciousness. So the understanding of brain dead itself is very superficial currently. But with these kinds of new technologies, we're beginning to see that there are layers and layers of consciousness which still reflect in the brain, and they can be now assessed much more usefully. So I think with this we close the part of the questions and we move on to the text which we have been studying. And the part today has to do with the psychic worlds. You remember last time we had this discussion of how the soul, having left the body, passes through the subtle physical realms and then through the formations which would have been the belief systems and the ideas and aspirations that the persons had by habit imprinted while in the body, and these create images around them, worlds as if which are constructed worlds, not real worlds, and so you actually pass through all that. Eventually, either those grades of substance begin to break down, or the pressure of the soul within dissolves them, and as a result the person wakes up to the real world of the vital or the mental realms. And then according to their interest, according to their priorities, they may take a relatively lesser or longer duration, even wandering those worlds, which would be again associated with things done or not done or intended and aspired for while in the physical body consciousness. So this whole part of this journey has been very interestingly represented in one of the movies which some of you might know already. It's called Inception. It was released in the year 2010, and I was actually hoping they would have a sequel to it, which didn't happen. In this movie, there is a technology by which a person is able to enter another person's mind and inside their dream, and then reshape the dream. So it's as if while you're dreaming, you're creating the worlds which are projections of your consciousness, but now somebody else can get into that and modify your worlds and modify your dreams in order to plant certain suggestions into you and influence you in various ways. This is the theme of the movie. But the way it has been represented, it's quite fascinating, and it's quite accurately represented. One of the things they show you when you go to the inner world, the relationship of time there and the layer outside is, I think they say 10x. So inside 10 minutes may pass while outside only 1 minute has passed. And if you go still deeper, you might have another 10x amplification of time speed. And so it's not accurate in that way, but the principle itself is valid. As you go deeper, the sense of time is can be much more rapid, or can actually be much slower also, depending on, it's all subjective. So, but still those subjectivities can have a ripple effect on the surface, and this part is well shown in the movie. And if you modify things on that inner level, in your belief worlds, it reflects in the outer, or the outer modifies the inner, and the inner influences the outer, and so on. So this constructed environments from which we then move on to the true vital worlds and mental worlds as created by the actual original cosmic life force, and so on. So Sri Aurobindo then summarizes that we go beyond these subtle physical planes of experience and life worlds, there are also mental and spiritual mental planes where the soul can have access. Last time while reading, one of the words I read, internally inhabit, it is internatally inhabit. So the point Aurobindo made was, unless you've developed something in the physical life of the access to the higher ranges of the mental and spiritual worlds, right there, going outside the body, you may not have the same access, or you may not have the same continuity. Even if you have that access, you may not be unable to return if you have not built the continuity while in the body. So being in the body and building the gradations of consciousness in continuum is so critical. Then he says, and this is the paragraph now we read briefly last time, but we'll take up. Even so, you've been through subtle, physical, vital, mental. Even so, the mental worlds are not likely to be the last normal stage of the after-death passage. For man is not entirely mental. It is the soul, the psychic being, and not the mind that is the traveler between death and birth. And the mental being is only a predominant element in the figure of its self-expression. So when the psychic being tries to express itself in formation, figure of self-expression, a predominant element is the mental being. So in that sense, from the psychic point of view, the mental body is our primary. We are mental beings. We are spiritual beings, but we are mental beings in terms of the expression in the planes of consciousness. Having then, with the life force, taking on a physical body and a physical experience. But we are essentially psychic, even if that is not the dominant part of our consciousness and the mental is dominant. So as we go through this gradation, remember the principle Sri Aurobindo said was, you leave the physical body, each of the parts of your consciousness is pulled into its equivalent grade of substance or world of consciousness. So where do you go first? Well, you go to that which is the strongest pull. Where do you go? Eventually, you go that which is the most essential and lasting part of you. Because other layers may be dissolved, other layers may be weakened, other layers may be discarded, etc. What remains more permanently, more truly you and the longest is obviously the psychic. But still he says, mental worlds are not likely to be the last normal stage. Meaning there could be cases where they will be. And so what makes for that? What makes this difference? And this is a very interesting, very important passage. So the real traveler is the psychic being. So eventually you have to go into the world that corresponds to its quality of consciousness. So there must then be a final resort to a plane of pure psychic existence in which the soul would await rebirth. Because that's where you would rest. Where do you rest? You rest when you come back into yourself. What's yourself? Well, not yet the mental is not the last part of yourself. It has to go all the way to the psychic. But your psychic may not be fully aware, may not be fully conscious, may not be mature enough, etc. So those are the things which will make the difference. So, but there the soul, because it's resting, coming back into itself, and there is nothing else which is more it. So that's where it will rest. There's nothing further to go to in terms of journeying. And it would await a rebirth. There it would assimilate the energies of its past experience and life and prepare its future. So who's the real person who's choosing to take birth, who is taking the substance and the essence of the experiences of its birth and building from it the nourishment and the personality for its future growth? It's always the psychic being. So it's only when you come back to the psychic poise of rest that this process really begins of assimilating energies of past experience and life and prepare its future. So two movements, one you assimilate and then from there you draw out what is necessary for the future. Not all of it would be taken, much of it would be left behind. All depends on the priority of the choice. Ordinarily, the normally developed human being who has risen to a sufficient power of mentality might be expected to pass successively through all these planes. So remember, if you have not developed sufficiently in mentality, you may not even reach this point. You may, from the vital itself, go back to reincarnate. Or, as we will see, from the vital, go into the soul rest. But then it will be more like a swoon of rest. But if you have developed enough, you pass through the subtle, physical, the vital, and then the mental. And then from there, you come to the psychic. So successively through all these planes, subtle, physical, vital and mental, on his way to his psychic habitation, ordinarily, in the normally developed human being. Why? Because you don't come into human experience unless you've already developed the mental body a little bit at least, enough to be able to do this in the normal domain of what we would call normal band of humanity. But there is subnormal also, so we'll come to this. At each stage, he would exhaust and get rid of the fractions of formed personality structure, temporary and superficial, that belonged to the past life. So as you go through these stages, you are getting rid of the part of your personality which belongs to that grade, and as you get rid of it, you move on to the next and the next. He would cast off his mind sheath and life sheath, as he had already cast off his body sheath. So think of it this way: the biology shed, you are in your subtle body. Of that subtle body, the vital gradation shed. Of that, the mental gradation shed. So you have three sheaths. And that's why in the yoga tradition they speak of three koshas. Annamaya, which is the physical kosha, Pranamaya, vital kosha, and the Manomaya, mental kosha. Kosha being sheath, covering. And you see the term is so appropriate. It covers, but you take it off, or you take it on in order to engage and identify with it, to experience things of that domain, to act in that domain of substance, and in a gradation of series all the way down to the material, to be able to exercise your experience and action in the material world. So there's an interdependency in a sequence as you take them on. So similarly, there's a sequence of shedding as you take them off. But, so you have cast off all this, but the essence of the personality of its mental, vital and physical experiences would remain in latent memory or as a dynamic potency for the future. So here's the part which we have to really deeply understand. What is this essence of personality of its mental, vital, physical experiences? You look back at your school years. They may have been good, bad, irrelevant. What was the overall sense of growth and learning that you had? That's the essence of the experience. I read all these books, I don't remember a thing about them. But having gone through all those, I have a general impression of all this knowledge or built up all this experience. That remains with you. So that's what is called the essence of the experience, shorn of the details of how the experience was had in the forms, to the content of the learning that was received. It is that which remains. Essence of personality of its mental, vital and physical experiences would remain in latent memory or as dynamic potency. So latent memory will be, it's as if a part of you remembers but not actively brought to the front. Or there's a power of that which is still pushing you and present within you as a power which is active. So it could be latent, held back as a memory at the backdrop, or as a persistent power right now. So let's say at the time of transition of life, you look back and you say, this is so important, I need to work upon this so much more. And the elements of the learning relating to this are brought forward, and there's a certain intensity, urgency, prioritization over it. And so as it prepares for the new life, this is a dynamic element. In the life, I look back, all these things I did, that was so useful, it was so nice, it enriched me, it's so good to keep this enrichment. And then that stays, but it does not have in itself a compulsion immediately. And that stays in this latent memory. You learned some beautiful music, you developed certain skills relating to artistic expression, or it's all there. It's not in the priority as a force right now for this expression for the new life. But if the development of mind were insufficient, it is possible that it would not be able to go consciously beyond the vital level. And the being would either fall back from there, returning from its vital heavens or purgatories to earth, or more consistently, would pass at once into a kind of psychic assimilative sleep, coextensive with the internatal period. to be awake in the higher planes, a certain development would be indispensable. So let's take the case of this. Development of mind is not sufficient. You are able to go up to the vital level. You're not able to enter the mental domain. From there, you either fall back to rebirth. So you go through the vital passages, he says, heavens or purgatories. So you go through, oh, I had all these attractions, desires, compulsions, ideals, hopes. You play with that, go through those passages until those are dissolved. And then having done that, shloop, you slide back to incarnate. Or, which is more often the case, as he says, because it's consistent with the nature of the current evolutionary stage. So you from there, from the vital, you slide into the psychic world, directly into the assimilative sleep. It is co-extensive with the internatal period. The entire period, which is between two births, is now held in that. Once you've come here, the rest of it is held there, but it is a kind of a sleep. Now, so we'll see a little more about what that sleep means from a psychic point of view. It means you are not awake to the fact that this is a psychic world. You are in a state of, in the psychic substance, in the psychic world, but the consciousness itself is indrawn in a deep assimilative state. It's not able to engage with, it's not able to assert its freedom. It's not able to act in an individualized way in that domain. So to be awake and not asleep, in the highest planes, a certain development would be indispensable. So again, I would put this as a question. Did you make this development in this lifetime or in prior lives? What effort did you make to build for this so that when you go into a psychic state of rest, you would actually be conscious and awake and not asleep? See, the natural state of a large number of undeveloped, insufficiently evolved psychic beings is one of a state of swoon, of deep, swoon-like sleep, rest between lives. And it's the reason why you see some people suddenly seem to be able to recall passages of that stage. And why? Because there has been a sufficient development of the kind required to be able to hold awareness in those states, to be able to retain a memory of what that state was about. Isn't it? And if you have not done that, you would not be able to even retain awareness and say, hey, I want to exercise a choice. I shared this experience perhaps maybe by now already twice at least. This lady I met in the United States, and she has unusual openings on the occult and subtle worlds, and quite a remarkable person I found. And then as we were talking, I just asked casually, I said, do you recall your the time before you took birth? And she said the only experience she had was, she said, at the time when she was preparing to take birth, the thought came, there has to be a way somewhere, there has to be some way by which I can remember this. So from that point on, the memory is there. Interesting. So from the point she decides, okay, I'm going to remember all this after incarnating, that memory stays on the surface in the incarnated personality. Obviously, the person I'm talking to is the personality, not the one who's incarnating, though that influence is very strong in her, obviously, otherwise there would not be this imprint. And then she says, as she was flowing down to incarnate, and there was this strong pull, she saw like points of light, and she was pulled towards the light. And she said, it's a very strange experience. Do you know anybody? Has anybody confirmed this? And I said, you have described exactly what the mother has described. So that means already a certain degree of maturity was developed enough that she could be on that plane and say, I choose this, I want this. Otherwise, in most cases, there's this swoon, you're in this, and then something comes up, forms, oh, this is what needs to be done, and then there's a turning from there towards life, and then there are beings who help you to find the right place, and maybe momentarily, as the consciousness approaches the more material, would be in this case the vital domains, then the consciousness again recovers its ability to retain its individuality in action, and from that point, normally the memory would be accessible. But anything higher, which goes closer to its actual domain of rest, where it can be awake, requires a certain development. So you remember earlier I have given you this visual of what happens after death. The common idea which is wrong, you are on earth, you go to heaven, you come back to earth, and you go back and forth. No, you don't. You shed the layers to the layer of your current development, and then you go horizontally into the psychic domain. Rest there, and then come back from there again to continue from there to the next higher grade, and then again go to rest, and again higher grade. But each of these gradations, when you go deep enough, you come to the core of that plane, which is the common layer which we would call the psychic. So unlike planes which are normally described as horizontal layers, the psychic plane is a backdrop across all planes. In each plane going to its essentiality of the divine principle at the underlying the substance of that plane, and in that you find the psychic plane. In that sense, it's a very different kind of plane or psychic world, you would say. Now, this, having given this in a very general way, Sri Aurobindo now goes into certain specifics. All this, however, is a matter of dynamic probability, meaning there are all kinds of things which can happen, probabilities, and at that moment, whatever probabilities pull and push would lead to specific outcomes. So it's not a static probability which was fixed. It's dynamic, meaning it's happening right now. Changes can happen as you move. And that, though amounting in practice to a necessity, though justified by certain facts of subliminal experience, is still for the reasoning mind not in itself quite conclusive. So we see the necessities of all this which we have discussed, and it can be confirmed by a fact of experience at a subliminal level, but to the reasoning mind, there's something missing. This is he is going to address. We have to ask whether there is any more essential necessity for these internatal intervals, or at least any of so great a dynamic power as to lead to an irresistible conclusion. So what is there that makes this internatal phase absolutely essential? What principle or what part of it would say, oh, this, now we agree, this is absolutely required. So we shall find one such necessity in the decisive part played by the higher planes in the earth evolution, and the relation that it has created between them and the evolving soul consciousness. So there's a relationship. There are all these higher planes which are as if from there influencing or presiding over earth evolution. And that relationship is going to be the critical element. Our development takes place very largely by their superior but hidden action upon the earth plane. Now what we don't realize is, even when in the middle of your passionate drive to success, to make money, to impress people, to earn whatever it is, suddenly something kicks in and you wake up and ask, what am I doing? Why am I doing? What do I really want? Where did that come from? That idea. There was nothing externally which would have triggered this. So it comes either from a deep impulse from within of the soul's aspiration. If the soul is mature enough, it says, hey, this personality is suffocating, and thrusts a strong push to shock, to wake, to influence. Or sometimes, if the personality is too rigidly rooted in what it has chosen, it bypasses the personality by creating a knock or a kick or an accident or a momentary hesitation or distraction which changes the whole direction of life. Or, if not from the inner, from above an influence that cuts through this and momentarily brings the light, and you are surprised and you question. And depending on what happens, if the light is strong enough, if it can take root, if within you there was already enough that was ready and the light triggered that, then it would lead to things. If not, momentarily you awake and say, hi, it's an important question, and then you go back to sleep. And sometimes a series of prods before you wake up. So the important point here is that this action is hidden. We do not know, we do not see how important it is though. Our development takes place very largely by their support, by the support of the higher planes, very largely by their superior but hidden action upon the earth plane. All is contained in the inconscient or the subconscient, but in potentiality. It is the action from above that helps to compel an emergence. So from the lower point of view, you will say, hey, I can do anything. There are all these possibilities and potentialities. Which of these kicks and wakes up? Why now? In what way? And that is determined rather by the action from above, which helps to compel an emergence. So it comes, nudges, and the emergence begins and is compelled. Helps to compel. But the compulsion itself may not always happen. So it can help, it can help, it can. Eventually the compulsion may kick in. So there's a lot of subtlety in this phrasing if you think about all its importance. A continuance of that action is necessary to shape and determine the progression of the mental and vital forms which our evolution takes in material nature. So why is it that this vital development took place? Why is it the mental development took place? Because of the persistent push compelling this to awaken in matter. For these progressive movements cannot find their full momentum or sufficiently develop their implications against the resistance of an inconscient or inert and ignorant material nature, except by a constant though occult resort to higher supraphysical forces of their own character. So if these things have to emerge in our material nature, the resistance of the inconscient, ignorant and inertia parts of nature are so strong that it would never happen by itself. There has to be a supraphysical force of that character, of the vital, of the mental, of the spiritual. So let's say broadly 3 kinds of influences which would come to awaken those equivalent things and would be strong enough to overcome the inertia and the inconscience and the ignorance and resistance of the lower nature. If there were not something which were more powerful and compelling, this evolution might never happen, or it would momentarily rise and then lapse back, and rise and lapse back, and rise and lapse back, which is often the case in the early stages. But each time the prod comes, it rises again. Each time it rises more and builds through a series of prods an ability now to recall its earlier awakenings as a support and now be able to stand on its own in a half awakening and stay on. So you see the long labor that has gone in this awakening just to build the life forms and then the mind forms and so on. This resort to the higher supraphysical force. This resort, the action of this veiled alliance, takes place principally in our subliminal being and not on the surface. So surface is this part which is the embodied mind and life force that you are familiar with. You say I. You go within into your dream state or in a deep meditation layer. And at that point you notice that's where the powers act, that's where the influences act. From there they reflect on the surface. Which is why going deep within, either in dream state or in meditative state, but really deep, allows you first to discover these kinds of influences which act and even to play with them actively, consciously modify them, but also to initiate from their impulsions which will act on the surface later. Not just in your life, but sometimes in your collective life, in your circumstances. So the ability to go there and to be able to act from there is an essential part if you really want to become a master of circumstances. Because that's where even this working is taking place. It is from there that the active power of our consciousness emerges, and all that is it realizes, it sends back constantly into the subliminal being to be stored up, developed, and re-emerge in stronger forms hereafter. So you have an experience, you have a growth, you have something, and then it goes back within and stores and piles up until eventually it comes forward. Each time there's a need, now you have a store of the same kind of experience which is backing the need of the effort now. And so it builds a habit pattern and a strength which is persisting and so on. This interaction of our larger hidden being and our surface personality is the main secret of the rapid development that operates in man once he has passed beyond the lower stages of mind immersed in matter. So the Hidden being is much larger, surface personality is small, and this interaction that from within pushes out and from outside experience stores within, this is the secret why once you've crossed the mind immersed in matter, the development can become extremely rapid. What is this mind immersed in matter? Is this consciousness where you say, my mind, my thought, my existence in awareness is formed of my biology. I am the body thinking. That's when you're dulled and slowed because you're identified with body. The moment you've shifted enough that your mind can stand back from body and say, hey, I have thoughts. My body tends to dull it, and I'm able to shift and separate from the body's dullness and apply those thoughts freely. That's where things begin to happen. And from there on, he says, the rapid development can take place because now the action of the inner and outer, that interaction can happen much more freely, having bypassed the inertia of this dullness. This resort must continue in the internatal stage. So if this relationship is there, you shed the body, obviously the same relationship will remain. For a new birth, a new life, is not a taking up of the development exactly where it stopped in the last. It does not merely repeat and continue our past surface personality and formation of nature. There is an assimilation, a discarding and strengthening and a rearrangement of the old characters and motives, a new ordering of the developments of the past, and a selection for the purposes of the future, without which the new start cannot be fruitful or carry forward the evolution. Now, this is the most important part to understand why it is necessary to have this rest in the psychic domain, in the psychic state, because if you don't have this, then the whole evolutionary process would become pointless and dramatically limited and bound to its own incapacity. Example, you're a warrior in a life, you're fighting, you die on the battleground. If now, in reincarnating, you continue exactly where you left off, you're again a warrior who's just been defeated and died in battle, maybe suffered a lot, and now taking birth with exactly the same problems that you had when you left. You could not become from there a poet, or a scientist, or an artist. Because you left off, you started exactly where you left off. So you'd be again in a warrior body, but with all the damage and the wounds of your past prior life, and now struggling with those wounds along with the problems of the warrior drives, and again probably repeating the same cycle and the same mistakes, or maybe learning from them a little more, becoming slightly better, and again dying with the same consciousness, and again taking off with the same consciousness in the next life, again as a warrior. And you'd have to struggle to say, hey, I need to become an artist at some point, so I'm going to start becoming an artist by ignoring my warrior tendencies. It doesn't work. So if you really want to have the utility of reincarnation, then there has to be this intermediate passage where you say, okay, this life was warrior, it was great, now I recognize I have neglected all this, I want to develop my refined artistic aspect. And so at that point you should be able to discard some of the warrior impulses or withdraw them, bring forward other impulses, prioritize them, rearrange, restructure, and build a totally new personality shape which now can reincarnate. It's still you, but with a totally different personality form. So I'm going to reread this and you see all the things which he's saying here. There is an assimilation. So first, it is not merely repeating, continuing a past surface personality and formation of nature. So there is an assimilation. That means all the surface things were stored within, remember? In the assimilation, you're taking out the essence of everything, and then a discarding what is not relevant. A strengthening, you amplify, yes, this part was very useful, I really need to prioritize this. A rearranging of the old characters and motives. So here I was fighting to defend an ideal. Now I want to actually deepen my experience of the ideal itself and express it now in music. So motives are different. Same thing, rearranging, something is pulled back, another is put forward, maybe directional correction, and something strengthened, something weakened, something discarded. A new ordering of the development of the past. So Now, if you look back with this way, across the last 20 lives, and each of them having specific variations, some having repetitions of the same theme. So you look at all that and you say, okay, now I'm going to reschedule this sequence, put this forward, and selection for the purposes of the future. So for this future, I need these. I don't need those. Those are pushed back. So remember, the larger part is the interaction from the inside to the surface, inside pushing the outer and storing the benefits of the outer. But it is here that that whole rearrangement has to take place, but going back across lives to the inside. For the purposes of the future, without which the new start cannot be fruitful or carry forward the evolution. So if evolution has to carry forward, not personality's impulse carry forward, then this becomes absolutely essential. And this is the compelling reason why there has to be internatal passage of rest. We continue. For each birth is a new start. It develops indeed from the past, but is not its mechanical continuation. So when you take a new birth, you have to start fresh with a totally fresh slate. You can't say, I'm just going to continue exactly the same thing. See, in a general way, we say in consciousness, you continue where you left off. General way. But that general has a totally different shape, form, quality, purpose, motive, direction, priority, and combination of qualities. So it's a fresh, clean, never been done before in this way. It develops indeed from the past, but is not its mechanical continuation. Rebirth is not a constant reiteration, but a progression. You don't repeat the same thing, you go forward. It is the machinery of an evolutionary process. So rebirth he describes as a machinery, because there's a sequence, there's a mechanism of the process. But it is machinery of evolutionary process, not constant repetition, reiteration. Part of this rearrangement, the discarding especially of past strong vibrations of the personality, can only be effected by an exhaustion of the push of previous mental, vital, physical motives after death. So you've left your body and you have all these mental, vital, physical drives and passions and compulsions. These have to be exhausted. If you have not exhausted them, they remain as forces and you're even unable to disengage from them, or they carry still as compulsions into the next formation. You have to exhaust them. For purpose of that exhaustion, you go through the gradations in which they are exhausted. So, and this internatal liberation or lightening of impedimenta, things which impediment, must be put through on the planes proper to the motives that are to be discarded or otherwise manipulated. So if there's a strong vital drive, it has to be exhausted in the vital plane. If there's a strong mental compulsion, it has to be exhausted in its plane. So you have to go through all these gradations, and especially where you have things which are binding and compelling, you have to pass through those grades to exhaust them. Those planes which are themselves of that nature, you can't exhaust on a different plane, obviously. For it is only there that the soul can still continue the activities which have to be exhausted and rejected from the consciousness, so that it can pass on to a new formation. So you say you were this soldier and you had this massive drive to do something wonderful for your country, but your entire soldier life was boring, you never even got into a war. What do? You have this passion, you have this compulsion. Well, when you leave your body, you exhaust those compulsions in your created worlds. I am this heroic warrior, I am going to achieve this, I do that, and you go through the scenario of that simulated exercise. The things you have dreamt of. I will become the hero, the entire country will worship me and thank me for this gigantic sacrifice. Well, it didn't happen when I left, and I look back, I didn't get that fun, I want to experience this now. And so I go through this created world. There I can become the hero of my story. I have all that satisfaction and the rewards, and I have my presidential medal which I stick on, and then I wonder, what is this trinket of metal really worth? Okay, it's symbolic, but the satisfaction of the drama that I was seeking, for which I worked, and which is a strong formation in my vital nature, now is exhausted. I have done it. I've been there, done that, now I'm ready to go on to the next. That's when you say now it's exhausted and you can move forward. Has to be done on that plane, or on the mental, or whatever gradations that those formations are. Remember what we read before in Sri Aurobindo's description. Wherever there are these strong formations, that's where you tend to get stuck and delayed. But now you see the purpose of that stuck and getting delayed, because that's where you purge, you exhaust those impulses for the soul to be free. And this is essentially, says, for the discarding of past strong vibrations of personality. Now you'll notice in people who live very, very long, as they grow older and older, most of these compulsions fade out. They become soft, gentle, sweet, almost like children, having no strong drives. Occasionally you do see people who have that, then you know those will be their impediments in the passage. But most of them, it's like everything is gone, I'm just this simple, quiet child, and a large psychic contentment behind, in which you live. If you have come to that point, you are kind of ripe for this transition, and you don't have to struggle through these layers. But especially when you have young people being thrown off too soon, then they have to go through some of that. So, because it's only on that plane that the soul can exhaust. So, for it is only there that the soul can still continue the activities which have to be exhausted and rejected from the consciousness, so that it can pass on to a new formation. If you want to build now an artistic formation, and the anger and the drama of the warrior consciousness is still strong, how are you going to get rid of that? So you pass through that grade, get rid of it. Now it's past, I've done it. I've had my satisfaction of my hero warrior thing. Now I can turn freely to my artistic experience. It is probable also that the integrating positive preparation would be carried out, and the character of the new life would be decided by the soul itself in a resort to its native habitat, a plane of psychic repose. So this integrating preparation of positive things, character of the new life, all this would take place in the plane of the psychic rest, where it would draw all back into itself and await its new stage in the evolution. This would mean a passage of the soul progressively through the subtle physical, vital and mental worlds to the psychic dwelling place, from which it would return to its terrestrial pilgrimage. So now we see the full rationale of why this is necessary, and it's even compelled upon for purpose of evolution. If our goal is evolution, that means you bring forward a new personality each time to have a new experience, you have to have this mechanism. So he's approaching it from an argumentative point of view of why, rather than saying, hey, this is how it is, which is what you'll find most authors say. But why should it be like that? Why couldn't it be simpler? Sri Aurobindo explains the machinery and the necessity for these elements of the machinery. And with the necessity, we see all the necessities rest upon this one single idea, that we are here for evolution. And what's needed for our evolution is what the machinery is trying to do. So rather than saying, hey, why do I have to wander in between and stay stuck in passages? You now say, you have to stay stuck in that passage for purpose of your evolution, to be able to exhaust the tendency which would interfere with the next formation. Now, yes, that makes sense. But he uses this word, from that psychic dwelling place, from which it would return to its terrestrial pilgrimage. It's a very beautiful idea. Pilgrimage, remember, is where you go, with struggle sometimes, with effort, to have a spiritual experience, isn't it? So the terrestrial pilgrimage is what the human birth is about. You're coming on earth for a spiritual experience, for a spiritual growth, for a spiritual learning, for your spiritual evolution. That's why your birth, your life is a pilgrimage, from which you go back to rest in the psychic world, and from which you again incarnate for the terrestrial pilgrimage. But the pilgrimage is of the earth domain, so terrestrial pilgrimage. The terrestrial gathering up and development of the materials thus prepared, their working out in the earth life, would be the consequence of this internatal resort. And the new birth would be a field of the resultant activity. So if you have now gone into this psychic space, you are gathered up, prepared the materials for the new work, whatever you have gathered now would become now the compulsion for the next incarnation. Remember, all this is coming from what? The relationship of the outer and inner. From the inner, the impulsions on the outer are exercised. From the experiences of the outer, the essence is then gathered and stored in the inner. So if you've gone into the inner, freeing yourself from the things which had to be exhausted, restructured, reshaped all the priorities, formed the new personality and new purpose and new motives and drives, having prepared this, the fact that you prepared this, it has inevitably to unfold in the lines set broadly. So, in their working out in the earth life, we would have the consequence of this internatal resort. And the new birth would be a field of the resultant activity. So, what is the result of this reshaping you did? Well, that's what the new birth is going to be. A new stadium or spiral curve in the individual evolution of the embodied spirit. So, stadium is the field on which the thing plays out. So, he's used 3 words: field of resultant activity, stadium of resultant activity, spiral curve of the resultant activity. So, in the first one, the field is this is the domain where it's happening, and the field here suggests a much larger scope where all the different beings playing out are present in the field. So, it's large game, complex game with so many players. In the second, the stadium is more like this a setup where what you have intended is working out, more like a drama of your chosen form. And the third is, in all this, the larger picture across lives is a spiral. You keep going through the birth and the return and the birth and the return, but each time a higher level and a higher level, and the spiral curve in the individual evolution of the embodied spirit. So he's speaking of here individual evolution, not collective, which is a different thing. For when we say that the soul on earth evolves successively the physical, vital, the mental and spiritual being, we do not mean that it creates them and that they had no previous existence. On the contrary, what it does is to manifest these principles of its spiritual entity under the conditions imposed by a world of physical nature. So this is now the next paragraph. We are not going to look at it now, because at this point we have a clear understanding of the whole process and the necessity and the compulsion of this process, of which the critical element is this complete withdrawal into the psychic domain in the psychic world where the real work of this reshaping is taking place. So there are 2 elements here: this process of withdrawal to the psychic world, and then the actual internatal trance of work of reshaping, from which the outcome would be inevitable, the new birth, because you formed it for a purpose. Eventually it has the purpose now created, becomes its own drive. Remember, it's always the inner influencing the outer, and so it will push to actualize itself into the new birth. That will follow. This movement of withdrawal is critical, the moment of restructuring is critical, and the consequence of that will be inevitable. So now we are going to look at this from a different angle. And this will be from a text of Sri Aurobindo in Savitri. And this is Book 2, Canto 14, The World Soul, where Sri Aurobindo describes the journey into the psychic world, the nature of the psychic world, and then the beings in the psychic world and what they are doing. It's a very beautiful and fascinating text. I'll briefly take a look at the chat box in case something important has to be. So Sanyik is asking how the psychic worlds are different from vital, mental and material world. Are they all interwoven like the different layers of a huge cake? Yes, it's not. The cake is not a good analogy because the layers are separated. Each layer spreads out into all other layers. So think of the sugar syrup that you insert into a layer of the cake. The sugar syrup from that layer with the coloring of that layer, let's say that coloring is red, it soaks into all the other layers, making them reddish. You have another layer which is blue, and the sugar syrup there now blue spreads and soaks into all other layers. That would be a better analogy. And the psychic would be as if the backdrop, or in the case of the cake, the center point, the center which holds the entire cake together, which is the whole essence of the cake itself, but spanning all the gradations. That would be a good analogy. Trinetra is asking, what are the realms and beings that exist in the inner realm? What are the spiritual benefits and necessity of going to the inner world and how to go in? Well, each plane has its own consciousness of that grade, and beings who are made of that substance and that grade, who then behave by the nature of that substance and that grade. So you go into the vital worlds, well, they will behave by the vital drives because they're made of the substance of the vital. So remember, evolution is individualizing everywhere, not only in the physical world, but all planes of all worlds, or rather all worlds of all planes. And each of these worlds, you have formations of individualities of various kinds, depending on the grade, because the lower vital is a very slimy, sticky area. You have sometimes forms emerging and then lapsing back at the lower grades. In the higher grades, you have more strongly individualized forms which live by their values. They do the things which correspond to that quality of consciousness. Well, what's the necessity? It's the play of all possibilities. But what is the importance? Each plane influences the physical world. So the fact that in the vital worlds there are these kinds of activities taking place corresponding to those grades, all those activities influence us on the physical world to trigger those tendencies in us. Now you can see all the gradations of whatever you think are vital drives. Well, you'll find all of them, literally worlds where you do just that. You only have gluttony, where you have only beautiful gourmet food, where you have only drives of passion, where you have only play of, and each being of that world would be of that, literally made of that substance. So in a sense, everything that happens in the physical world is as if a combination of all the higher worlds now impinging upon earth circumstances. So what is the spiritual benefit and necessity of going into those planes where you realize these are the sources of all these impulsions within you, but it's also for you stages of development to develop the powers corresponding to each of these grades. And each of those gradations and their native powers have to be spiritualized and organized around the soul's power of action. And so the passionate drive, which is chaotic, let's say of a lower vital type, might once purified becomes a very precise, narrow, focused, intense activity of joy or playful character even. But you have to acquire that substance and that the power of that substance and awaken it and divinize it. Then you have the full potency of all the gradations in your individual consciousness. I'm just scanning through. There's some, Vishweshwar says, the movie Contact mildly touches the idea of helpers coming to you in a form you consider most benevolent. Yes, so sometimes a lot of movies have tried to capture some of these things. There's one beautiful movie, one of the most extraordinary in its visualization of the world after death, which is called What Dreams May Come. And it is a very famous actor, Robin Williams, I think, who, I think his wife commits suicide and he goes to find her into the hells and brings her back. It's a very beautiful movie. I would highly recommend for all of you to watch that if you can. It's a good visualization and it gives you a sense of what those worlds actually might look like. So yes, Tutun is asking, did Aurangzeb go free so lightly? No, obviously not. He would have gone through many more births in between, many more struggles in between. This was an occasion where he was brought into the spiritual domain, perhaps after having gone through many things, but a certain turn was given. You must understand that even where you have had tyrannical individuals in history, sometimes they have been used by the higher consciousness for extraordinary work. A good example is considered to be Napoleon, who was considered by most people to be an extraordinary tyrant, but Sri Aurobindo actually says in his Thoughts and Aphorisms that he saw God's hand, I don't know the exact word he uses, but going through rapidly through Europe and clearing up things to arrange for some greater work. So there are many who have been used as instruments despite them being despots or tyrants, even sometimes with strong asuric tendencies. But the divine will always find a way to use their power, to use their energy for some greater work also. And sometimes some of them have actually turned subsequently to want to serve the divine with the huge vitality and power they have. So there are many complexities. I do not know what was in this case. The point was that he was working upon those things on a level which we would never fully be able to appreciate. Riyadh says, my psychic being got me fired. I don't know if it's as simple as that, but sometimes it can happen also. But rather it was used the occasion of you getting fired for some other outcome. And that is more likely the case. So SRJMD is asking, when one feels a warmth or heat behind the heart during meditation, is that the touch of the psychic? Not necessarily. It could be the touch of your devotional emotions, which would give the heat generally. The psychic influence in itself is a very deep stillness and quietude, in which when you go deep enough, you begin to feel as if you are eternal. And there is a deep sense of intimacy with the divine presence, with the divine mother, in whichever way you naturally feel that affinity. And the intimacy is almost as if you're a part of her like a child. This is the very distinctive quality that is associated with the psychic presence. Deep stillness, deep purity, deep intimacy with the divine and being a part of the divine. But this alone doesn't mean you've reached the psychic. It means you're in a part where there's a strong influence of the psychic. And then you would go deeper and deeper into the source of that influence, and eventually you would find the presence in itself. But this is what you should increasingly become conscious of within you, and let its influence come forward and fill you. Most cases, though, it is heavily mixed with devotion and emotion. And often with that, the emotions intensify and they cloud and cover the deeper psychic purity and stillness that originally filled them or triggered them. And you must be careful not to let that happen. So SRJMD is saying, planes where one exhausts the desires feel like the holodeck described in the Star Trek series. Yes, in fact, it's quite interesting to see how much of our passions we exhaust in life through cinema. Because cinema has become a kind of a vicarious experience. When you go through a movie, well made, you literally live through that life. And you come back from it with something that says, as if you have lived that whole life and now come back into this. And you have as if something of the essence of that carried into you. It can be very useful. If you choose your cinema carefully, you can go through many kinds of life experience without needing to go through them fully materially. And it's like in 1 hour you condense an entire lifetime of heroism, courage, romance, loss, success, whatever it is of various kinds. But you need to do it with judicious care, so that you don't just wallow in something. You use it as a means of growth. So we come back now to the text. I said we will explore the psychic world from the World Soul, Canto 14. A covert answer to his seeking came in a far shimmering background of mind space. A glowing mouth was seen, a luminous shaft. A recluse gate it seemed, musing on joy. A veiled retreat and escape to mystery. Now this is the description of the entrance into the psychic, towards the psychic world, let's say. So he's seeking, and in answer to that, in the far shimmering background of mind space. So it is as if at the back of your awareness of mind consciousness, and mind consciousness, remember, includes also ranges of the higher vital. So generally the center physically is seated in the chest region, but more easily felt slightly higher in the chest because it bypasses the emotions. But for many it is an entrance is also through the mind, because the emotions are so blocked up. So you go through the mind into the... But that is not so important right now. Just understand that it is in your consciousness wherever it is now. You turn... A glowing mouth was seen, a luminous shaft, a recluse gate, musing on joy. It's as if as you turn towards them, something in you says, I remember some kind of joy, as if I dwell in the sense of a deep joy, and something is hidden deep within, a withdrawal into something hidden, a veiled retreat, and an escape to mystery. Something covered up, something deeply secret, something sacred, spiritual, and you escape into that. Away from the unsatisfied surface world, it fled into the bosom of the unknown. And what's this inward movement? A well, a tunnel of the depths of God. It plunged as if a mystic groove of hope. It's like a groove. As you slide into it, there's a passage where it actually takes you by familiarity deeper and deeper. But it's a mystic groove, and you have the sense of the sacred as you are drawn into it. And you plunge and rapidly sometimes through many layers of formless, voiceless self to reach the last profound of the world's heart. So remember, this is Ashwapati in the out-of-body state entering the psychic world. So the opening appears, but it's a replica exactly in objectivized terms of what you experience subjectively within you inward. In response to your aspiration, in remembrance of the mother, well, the opening appears to you, and you plunge and slide into it. The same thing happens when in the out-of-body state. You yearn for that, and in response, the passage opens and you enter, slide into it. So I'm skipping a lot of things. You would want to read it on your own, and skipping literally a page. And then the inward movement is described as a tinkling of a caravan, like a temple gong, a bee crooning, honey drunk. So there's as if incense floating in quivering air, mystic happiness trembled in the breast, as if the invisible beloved had come, assuming the sudden loveliness of her face, and close glad hands could seize his fugitive feet, and the world changed with the beauty of a smile. So the presence of the Lord, the divine consciousness, is felt here, and the joy that comes with that touch. All of these are characteristic of the approach to the psychic center. It's not emotional, it is much more essential, of the essential bhakti. A home of a passion without name or voice. A depth he felt answering to every height. A nook was formed that could embrace all worlds. From that center, it's as if you can hold everything. A point that was the conscious knot of space, and our eternal in the heart of time. So while you're in the domain of time, when you go into that, it is as if you feel the touch of eternity. The silent soul of all the world was there. A being lived, a presence and a power, a single person who was himself and all, and cherished nature's sweet and dangerous throbs. Transfigured into beats divine and pure, one who could love without return for love. Meeting and turning to the best, the worst. It healed the bitter cruelties of earth, transforming all experience to delight. So you are literally, as going in from the psychic point of view, there's a delight to every experience. What was their painful experience as you go within becomes, oh, interesting delight, interesting variation of the colors of the experience. So it has that power to be able to transmute everything from its perspective to this. Again, I skip a lot. All grew to all kindred and self and near. The intimacy of God was everywhere. No veil was felt, no brute barrier inert. Distance could not divide. An inner happiness abode in all, a sense of universal harmonies. Here was the welling core of finite life. A formless spirit became the soul of form. All there was soul or made of sheer soul stuff. A sky of soul covered a deep soul ground. All here was known by spiritual sense. Thought was not there, but a knowledge near and one seized on all things by moved identity. So he's describing now in this domain not only the substance, but the way, the equivalent of knowledge, not by thought. How do you touch? How do you feel? Each of these is described. I will touch a few, only to give you a whiff of the mood. A sympathy of self with other selves. The touch of consciousness on consciousness. So it's consciousness that is, not form. The beings look on being with inmost gaze and heart laid bare to heart without walls of speech. And the unanimity of seeing minds, in myriad forms luminous with the one God. Life was not there, there's no life force, but an impassioned force, finer than fineness, deeper than the deeps, felt as a subtle and spiritual power, a quivering out from soul to answering soul. This is the nature of the equivalent of the life experience in the substance of the psychic. A mystic movement, a close influence, a free and happy and intense approach of being to being, with no screen or check, without which life and love could never have been. Interesting. If that was not there in the psychic world, life and love, as in the devotional, emotional, and surface vital experience, could not be possible. So it's as if they are crude representations of this essential truth which belongs to the psychic. Body was not there, for bodies were needed not. The soul itself was its own deathless form and met at once the touch of other souls. And what's the nature of that touch? Close, blissful, concrete, wonderfully true. As when one walks in sleep through luminous dreams and conscious knows the truth their figures mean, here, where reality was its own dream, he knew things by their soul and not their shape. So, I'm reminding you of the discussion we had right at the beginning, not to bind to form, because especially when you enter the deeper ranges and the more you approach the psychic, you know things in themselves, not in form. And to be able to be free of form and know the thing in essentiality of consciousness and substance and quality and force is your great strength, to be able to meet and explore these worlds purely. So. He knew things by their soul and not their shape. As those who have lived long, made one in love, need word nor sign for heart's reply to heart. He met and communed without bar of speech with beings unveiled by a material frame. There was a strange spiritual scenery, a loveliness of lakes and streams and hills, a flow, a fixity in a soul space, and plains and valleys stretched of soul joy. The soul joy is the plain and the valley. And gardens that were flower tracks of the spirit. So here it's difficult for us to understand because we are putting a picture of the earth world. The reality is there that the soul joy, when it goes in sustained flow, becomes the plain. The soul joy, when it flows in intensity to rise in a crescendo and fall, becomes the hill. The soul joy, when it surges to depth and rises from depth again, becomes the valley. So the valley is not just the physical shape, the valley is the way the soul joy flows in that mood of movement. And when you enter the valley, you experience this. When you rise on the hill, you experience this. So you see, the hills and valleys are not really shape, they're experience, but they're perceived in shape of experience. If that you catch, then you get the idea of what it's like. Catch that and let it catch you in a more intuitive grade rather than picturing grade. Yes? And gardens that were flower tracts of the spirit. It's meditations of tinged reverie. The garden is as if in meditations, and the flowers as if in each in a certain tinge, a quality, a color of its dream or dwelling on a certain aspect. Air was the breath of a pure infinite. A fragrance wandered in a colored haze, as if the scent and hue of all sweet flowers had mingled to copy heaven's atmosphere, appealing to the soul and not the eye. You see, when you see a beautiful scene, your eyes feel happy. Here it is your soul which feels directly, intimately. All it sees is felt intimately close as within you. Not far away, intimately close, even in the scenery that is at a distance, it's intimately close. Everything is intimately close. Beauty lived there at home in her own house. There, all was beautiful by its own right. and needed not the splendor of a robe. All objects were like the bodies of the gods, a spirit symbol environing a soul, for world and self were one reality. Soul is surrounded by the symbol of spirit, so the expression in form of body which makes for the object is the thing itself of the soul. For world and soul were one reality. Having described this domain, now we look at the beings. Who are the denizens or passengers here? Immersed in voiceless internatal trance, the beings that once wore forms on earth sat there in shining chambers of spiritual sleep. So first we are seeing this. Beings that were once, they had put on forms on earth. Now they've shed those forms like clothing, 3 layers. And are in this shining chambers of spiritual sleep. The presence is of the light of the psychic. And their sleep indrawn is a spiritual sleep. What is a spiritual sleep? Normal sleep is inconscious, unconscious, inconscient, subconscious sleep. Spiritual sleep is you're immersed in spirit within yourself. So it's a state of inward trance. Immersed in voiceless internatal trance between 2 births, but voiceless. They are not in expression. No movement. Total stillness, which is of course the nature of the psychic presence and substance, but here is the state of indrawn. Past were the pillar posts of birth and death. Past were their little scenes of symbol deeds. It's literally little like cinema scenes. They've gone. Past were the heavens and hells of their long road. So you see 3 things. Pillar post of birth and death, that is gone. The scenes of their symbol deeds have gone, things you did on earth. And then in the transition, the heavens and hells through which you passed, the long road to come to the psychic domain, that's also now gone. So summing up in brief what we have read in some detail. They had returned into the world's deep soul. All now was gathered into pregnant rest. Pregnant because it is building. In the rest, it's a state of building, gathering in order to give birth to new life. So gathered, it's not a passive, static state. It's building gradually, forming, shaping until it is ready and it bursts out into expression. Person and nature suffered a slumber change. So as if through sleep, the act of sleep itself is a complete transmutation. You change as a person. I was warrior, now I'll be artist. Nature also changes. Our strong fightings with violence of force, and now suddenly I become soft, tender and differently in nature. So person and nature suffered a slumber change. That is, through this sleep, you've become from, let's say, as an analogy, caterpillar to butterfly. So, in trance, they gathered back their bygone selves. So all the selves, not just this one life, all selves are gathered in this trance state. In a background memory's foreseeing muse, prophetic of new personality. So all this memory is held in the background, but the memory is not looking like that at the past. The memory gathered is looking at the future and dwelling on the future. A muse is prophesying, prophetic of new personality. From this memory is the gathered sum of the new direction I want to take to. It's forming, predicting, propheting, prophesying. But what is prophecy is not merely intention, it is inevitable outcome. So as you turn, that becomes inevitable outcome. Arranged the map of their coming destiny's course. So literally, as these things are gathered and prepared, looking forward, there's a map set. And this is something quite fascinating. There are meetings which are set. There are transition points which are set. Key positions are decided in advance. The specifics are not. Sometimes a time is fixed. Sometimes a location is fixed. Sometimes a circumstance is fixed. But it's free choice. So there are cases, for example, somebody goes through a normal life and pop at a certain age wakes up and says, hey, this is what I'm here for, and you move forward. What decided? Well, that was already preset in the soul's choice. Okay, I will first build my personality, living like a normal person with my consciously chosen cover to hold back the higher knowledge of what my purpose is. And then when the time comes, pop, the veil is rent and this comes forward. But it was all preset, chosen. So arrange the map of their coming destiny's course, and that's the sense of the mapping. Heirs of the past, you inherit your past. They're future's discoverers. You will form and discover what is concealed in the future. Electors of their own self-chosen lot. You have chosen your own outcomes. They waited for the adventure of new life. So the psychic perspective is that life is a huge, beautiful adventure. And each birth is a new adventure. There is no sense of struggle or pain of wanting to take birth. It's always a joyous turn. A person, capital P, the psychic being, persistent through the lapse of worlds. Entire worlds could be destroyed and this person would still be persisting. Although the same, forever in many shapes, by the outward mind unrecognizable. Each birth, you have taken on a new shape. Outer mind will never recognize, oh, you are that same thing. But you internally as a person are forever the same. It's the same person, it's still me. Assuming names unknown in unknown climes. Imprints through time upon the earth's worn page a growing figure of its secret self. So across, as if earth's page where the history of earth is being written, he imprints through time these through different names in unknown names, unknown climates, spaces, and through it all, as it imprints a growing figure of its secret self. There's the growth. And learns by experience what the spirit knew. So deep within you already know, through experience you learn. Till it can see its truth alive and God. So your own truth comes, it takes form, and God takes form. Once more they must face the problem game of birth. So you have a game, but it's a problem game, full of challenges. At every step you have to solve issues, resolve issues, and solve the problem. The soul's experiment of joy and grief and thought and impulse, lighting the blind act, and venture on the roads of circumstance through inner movement and external scenes, traveling to self across the forms of things. Into creation's center he had come. So this is where Ashwapriya has arrived, in the center of all creation. So the analogy earlier of the cake, well, you're right there in the center of it all. The spirit wandering from state to state finds here the silence of its starting point in the formless force and the still fixity and brooding passion of the world of soul. You come home, that's your starting point, everything begins from here, it's the center of it all. All that is made, and once again unmade. The calm, persistent vision of the one inevitably remakes. It lives anew. Forces and lives and beings and ideas are taken into stillness for a while. There they remold their purpose and their drift, recast their nature and reform their shape. Ever they change, and changing ever grow, and passing through a fruitful stage of death, and after long and reconstituting sleep, resume their place in the process of the gods. So this whole thing which we have been reading about, reforming, recasting their nature, changing, ever grow through the change. So after fruitful stage of death, reconstituting sleep, long reconstituting sleep, you come back, resume their place in the process of the gods. You're now again in the domain where the cosmic forces are working, until their work in cosmic time is done. So all these beings, all of us in that sense, are in this. Here was the fashioning chamber of the worlds. Everything is formed here. An interval twixt act and act, between two great actions, this is the interval where things are brought to rest and reshaped. Twixt birth and birth, between birth, twixt dream and waking dream, a pause that gave new strength to do and be. Beyond were regions of delight and peace. So here you see, you've come to the center, you rest there, reshape, recast, and then move back into the new action. So again, I'm going to skip large Maybe that's about all I wanted to cover. And it is from here that he has the experience of seeing the Divine Mother. He sees the higher. And in response to his aspiration, the Divine Mother partly opens her veil. And the canto finishes, he fell down at her feet, unconscious, prone. So all of you, I would highly recommend read this while you're in this mood, where you have already a sense of the feel of that space. Read it, let it soak into you, let it become familiar with you. Something deep inside you will recognize the mood of that world and that state, because that's our home. That's where we go back to. That's from there that we take birth. And it's the most deep, the most intimately known space in the whole cosmos, isn't it? It's our birth space, remember, a space from which we take birth. So as you read, you'll find deep resonances, deep memories. They'll all be of a grade which is non-mental, not emotional, but deeply intuitive or even psychic. Just let the mood of that, let the familiarity of that soak in as you read this whole canto. And we saw how, in a few broad strokes, all that was elaborated in some detail in the chapter we read in the Life Divine. It's all been covered and summarized. If you had that background, you understand how important each word here is. If you have read this, then the mood of this, the truth of this is felt when you read the text in the Life Divine. They, so to say, mutually nourish and complement each other in the experience. So we're going to pause here for today. Remember, this is your home. We are children of immortality. We are immortal beings. And between lives we rest, come back to rest in order to take once again another step in our adventure. But the most critical aspect of all that we read today was the importance that to be awake in the higher planes, a certain development would be indispensable. Even to be in the psychic world and be conscious as a psychic being, to be able to act and even consciously form things and release forces and actions from there, one has to have developed psychically in the individualization of the psychic being. So all of this is a reminder for us to do our real work for which we are born while in the body, while in the life, through the circumstances that come before us. Use the time. Every moment, every day is precious once you're conscious of this. And in the body is the most rapid growth possible for a given effort, because everything is interconnected here, everything is bound together. But if in the body, in the daily act, in the daily thought, feeling and action, you have been able to touch something of the psychic influence, invoke that, invite that, feel that, draw from there, be inspired by that, or open to something higher, some light, some touch of the peace, joy, love, presence of the Divine Mother, then you have, in that single touch, touched all the other layers and helped them all to grow a little bit more and integrate a little more and align more and more around this center. If there was one thing which would be essential and most important in your life, would be to put everything, all of you, every part, every activity, every expression, in alignment to a deeper, perhaps the deepest center that is yours. Or from there in alignment to that which is the very origin of our existence in the divine consciousness. If there's one thing you can do, it is to align everything to this. For which then to be more and more conscious of this, and to let that influence, however subtle, however finely felt, be more and more present in the midst of your all activities. This would be the effort to be made at all times, to the extent you can. So let's take a moment in concentration in this aspiration.